The sound of metal scraping against wood pierced through my living room window at exactly 3:47 in the afternoon. I looked up from my laptop, and what I saw made my blood turn to ice. Margaret Henderson, the HOA president who'd been making our lives miserable for 8 months, was wrapping a chain around my 9-year-old daughter Emma's waist, padlocking her to our front porch railing like some animal. Emma was crying, her pale face streaked with tears, still wearing her unicorn pajamas because she'd been too sick with the flu to get dressed that morning. Margaret's lips were moving, her face twisted in that familiar expression of righteous fury, probably spouting off some imaginary HOA violation that existed only in her deranged mind. Before we dive into what happened next, please do something for me. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from, because what you're about to witness is the most satisfying takedown of an HOA tyrant you'll ever see. And trust me, Margaret Henderson had no idea who she was dealing with. She thought I was just another suburban dad she could bully. She had no clue I was the chief of police for our entire county. My name is Marcus Chen, and 6 years ago, I moved into the Riverside Meadows community with my wife, Sarah, and our daughter, Emma. Back then, it seemed perfect. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained homes, kids riding bikes in the evening, neighbors who waved and smiled. The American dream wrapped up in a tidy suburban package. I'd just been promoted to chief of police after 22 years on the force. The job was demanding, sure, but I'd finally reached a point where I could provide stability for my family. Sarah worked as a pediatric nurse at County General, and Emma was thriving in 3rd grade. We'd saved for years to afford a home in a good neighborhood with excellent schools. The HOA seemed reasonable at first. Monthly dues covered landscaping, the community pool, and maintaining common areas. The rules were standard: keep your lawn mowed, no major exterior modifications without approval, and don't leave trash cans visible from the street. Nothing we couldn't handle. Then Margaret Henderson got elected HOA president. She was in her late 50s, always dressed like she was heading to a country club board meeting, even when she was checking mailboxes. Perfectly styled silver hair, designer sunglasses perched on her head, driving a white Mercedes SUV with vanity plates that read, Boss Eldai. She lived in the largest house in the development, a sprawling colonial with columns that she'd somehow convinced the previous board to approve, despite it violating the original architectural guidelines. Margaret had retired early from some corporate management position, and from what I'd heard from neighbors, she'd made it her full-time job to control every aspect of Riverside Meadows. Her husband Gerald was rarely seen, probably working 16-hour days to afford Margaret's lifestyle and escape her presence. The first incident happened about 3 weeks after she took office. I came home from a particularly brutal shift, a domestic violence case that had required crisis intervention and nearly ended in tragedy. It was past midnight, and I'd barely dragged myself through the door when I noticed the bright orange envelope stuck to it. A violation notice for leaving my trash cans out past 7 p.m. on collection day. The thing was, collection in our neighborhood didn't happen until after 8 a.m., and the HOA rules clearly stated we could put cans out the night before. I'd checked when we moved in because I often worked late and needed to know the schedule. But Margaret had apparently decided to reinterpret the rules. Her notice cited a visual blight clause and threatened a $50 fine if it happened again. I was too exhausted to argue. It was a misunderstanding, maybe overzealousness from a new president trying to make her mark. I sent a polite email explaining the situation and assumed that would be the end of it. I was so wrong. 2 weeks later, another orange envelope appeared. This time, the violation was for my lawn being unevenly maintained. I'd mowed it 3 days earlier, the same way I always did, the same way my neighbors did. I walked outside and stared at my perfectly normal suburban lawn, trying to figure out what Margaret was seeing that I couldn't. That's when I noticed her across the street, standing in Mrs. Patterson's driveway with a clipboard, staring directly at my house. She saw me looking and smiled, this cold little smirk that made my cop instincts tingle. This wasn't about the lawn. This was about control. The fines started coming weekly after that. My house numbers weren't reflective enough. My mailbox had a small rust spot. My daughter's pink bicycle, left on the front lawn overnight, was outdoor equipment improperly stored. Each violation came with a $50 to $100 fine, and Margaret's notices always included a condescending paragraph about community standards and property values. Sarah tried to laugh it off at first. We'd always paid our bills on time, followed the rules, and been good neighbors. But even she started getting tense when the notices kept coming. Emma picked up on it too, asking why the mean lady kept leaving orange papers on our door. I tried the diplomatic approach. I called Margaret and requested a meeting to discuss the violations. She agreed to meet at her house, and I showed up with a folder containing photos of my property alongside neighbors' properties, demonstrating that I was maintaining everything to the same standard as everyone else. Margaret sat across from me in her pristine living room, sipping tea from a china cup, and listened with that same cold smile. When I finished, she set down her cup and said, "Chief Chen, I appreciate you taking the time, but these violations are quite clear. Perhaps you're too busy with your demanding job to maintain your property properly? No one is above the HOA covenants, not even law enforcement." The way she emphasized Chief Chen and law enforcement told me everything I needed to know. She'd looked me up. She knew exactly who I was, and she didn't care. In fact, I got the distinct impression she enjoyed it more because of my position. Are you starting to see what kind of person we're dealing with here? Have you ever wondered what happens when someone who spent years wielding unchecked power suddenly loses everything? Keep watching, because Margaret's downfall was absolute. The Reddit threads were merciless. Someone created a detailed post in the HOA subreddit titled "The HOA President Who Chained a Sick Child and Stole $63K." It went viral, hitting the front page with 40,000 upvotes and thousands of comments. People shared their own HOA horror stories, but they all agreed. Margaret Henderson had taken it to a whole new level of evil. The local Facebook community groups turned on her completely. The same neighbors who'd been too afraid to speak up while she held power now shared their stories publicly. Photos of ridiculous violation notices, screenshots of threatening emails, videos of her driving through the neighborhood with her phone out, stalking properties for infractions. One neighbor even posted security footage of Margaret measuring the height of someone's mailbox with a ruler at 6 in the morning, then issuing a violation notice claiming it was a quarter-inch too tall. The post was captioned, "This woman terrorized us for years." It was shared over 3,000 times. Margaret tried to defend herself online, creating social media accounts to tell her side of the story. But her version just made things worse. She claimed she was the victim of a conspiracy led by a corrupt police chief who wanted to avoid accountability. She insisted she'd done nothing wrong, that the financial irregularities were accounting errors, that she'd only been trying to maintain community standards. Nobody believed her. The evidence was too overwhelming, too well documented, too public. Her supposed friends abandoned her. The country club women she'd lunched with suddenly had no memory of knowing her well. The charity organizations where she'd been on boards quietly removed her name from their websites. Even her own sister gave an interview to local news, saying she'd warned Margaret years ago that her need to control everything would eventually destroy her. Gerald filed for divorce within 2 weeks of the HOA meeting. The court filings were public record, and they were devastating. He detailed years of emotional abuse, financial manipulation, and Margaret's escalating obsession with controlling the neighborhood. He asked for his name to be removed from all HOA-related lawsuits as he'd played no role in her schemes. The civil lawsuit came next. As the newly elected HOA board, we filed suit against Margaret Henderson for the return of embezzled funds, plus damages for emotional distress suffered by homeowners she'd harassed. Our attorney was confident we had an airtight case. Margaret tried to countersue, claiming I'd orchestrated a witch hunt, violated her civil rights, and defamed her character. Her lawsuit was dismissed within 3 months. The judge took one look at the mountain of evidence and called her claims frivolous and without merit. But the criminal trial was the main event. It took 8 months to get to trial. Margaret's attorney tried every delay tactic imaginable, but the prosecutor was relentless. When we finally walked into that courtroom, I brought Emma with me. She was 10 now, stronger and healthier. But she remembered that day on the porch when Margaret had tried to chain her for a photograph. The prosecution called 47 witnesses, neighbors who'd paid fines under duress, the forensic accountant who explained the money trail, Gerald Henderson, who testified about discovering the fraud and his wife's obsessive behavior, and me. I testified for 6 hours over 2 days. I walked the jury through every violation notice, every payment, every threatening email and staged photograph. I showed them the security footage of Margaret positioning that chain on my daughter. I explained how she'd created a climate of fear in a suburban neighborhood that should have been peaceful and safe. Margaret's attorney tried to paint me as a vindictive cop abusing my authority, but the evidence spoke for itself. This wasn't about my badge. This was about a woman who'd systematically terrorized and stolen from an entire community. The jury deliberated for 3 hours, guilty on 12 counts of fraud, embezzlement, and extortion. When the verdict was read, Margaret's face crumpled. She'd been so convinced she'd win, so certain her attorney would successfully portray her as the victim of a conspiracy. The reality hit her like a physical blow. Sentencing came 6 weeks later. The judge was a woman in her 60s who'd clearly read every page of the case file. She looked at Margaret with barely concealed disgust. "Mrs. Henderson, you were entrusted with the financial well-being and governance of a community. Instead of serving your neighbors, you preyed on them. You created an atmosphere of fear and intimidation. You stole from families, harassed a sick child, and showed no remorse whatsoever." The judge sentenced Margaret to 6 years in state prison, with restitution of $63,000 plus interest and penalties. She'd serve at least 4 years before being eligible for parole. Margaret wept as they led her away in handcuffs. Her carefully styled hair was falling out of its clip, her designer suit wrinkled, her makeup running. She looked like what she was, a bully who'd finally been held accountable. The community erupted in applause right there in the courtroom until the bailiff called for order. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed us. Mrs. Patterson gave an emotional statement about feeling safe in her home for the first time in years. Tom Ramirez talked about his kids finally being able to play in their own yard without fear of violations. Linda Martinez announced that the HOA was implementing new oversight procedures to ensure this could never happen again. I kept my statement simple. Justice was served today. Not because I'm a police chief, but because a community stood together and refused to be victims anymore. The story made national news again. HOA tyrant sentenced to 6 years for reign of terror. The conviction sent shockwaves through HOA communities nationwide. Suddenly, HOA presidents were being scrutinized, financial records were being audited, and homeowners were standing up to abusive boards. Margaret Henderson had become a cautionary tale, a symbol of what happens when petty power goes unchecked. But for us, for Riverside Meadows, it wasn't about making history or setting precedents. It was about getting our neighborhood back. 6 months after Margaret's sentencing, I stood in my front yard on a Saturday morning, watching Emma ride her bike in circles on our driveway. She was wearing bright purple pajamas under a jacket because it was early and she wanted to be outside, and nobody was going to tell her what she could wear in her own yard. Sarah was planting new flowers in our front beds, humming along to music from her phone. We'd gotten bold with our choices, vibrant yellows and oranges that definitely pushed the boundaries of the approved color palette. Nobody cared. The new HOA board had quietly voted to relax about half of the overly restrictive rules Margaret had implemented. Tom Ramirez walked by, walking his dog, and waved. "Board meeting Tuesday night, right?" "Yep, 7 p.m. at the clubhouse. We're voting on the new playground equipment." Finally, my kids have been asking about that for months. Life in Riverside Meadows had transformed. The fear and tension that had permeated every interaction were gone, replaced by actual community spirit. People talked to each other on the street. Kids played together without parents worrying about violation notices for sidewalk chalk or misplaced toys. We'd implemented new HOA rules focused on actual community building rather than punishment. Monthly family events at the pool, a community garden where residents could grow vegetables, a lending library in the clubhouse, a neighborhood watch that was about looking out for each other, not spying for violations. The financial restitution from Margaret, combined with proper management of the HOA funds, meant we'd been able to make real improvements. New playground equipment, repaved walking paths, updated landscaping in common areas, actual community enhancements instead of money disappearing into fake vendor accounts. Mrs. Patterson had become our garden coordinator. Her flower expertise was finally appreciated instead of being punished. The Ramirez family hosted regular weekend barbecues that half the neighborhood attended. Linda Martinez used her legal background to help other homeowners review contracts and understand their rights. And me? I stepped down as HOA president after 1 year. I'd done what needed doing, stabilized the organization, implemented proper oversight, restored trust in the system. But I was a police chief, not a career HOA administrator. I handed the reins to Sarah, who discovered she actually enjoyed community organizing and had a gift for bringing people together. I returned to focusing on my day job, though the case had taught me something valuable about the nature of power and accountability. Whether it was a police department or a homeowners association, unchecked authority inevitably led to abuse. Transparency, oversight, and community involvement weren't just nice ideas. They were essential safeguards. Emma adjusted well, all things considered. We'd gotten her into therapy after the Margaret situation to make sure she processed everything healthily. The therapist said Emma was resilient, that she'd learned an important lesson about standing up to bullies and the importance of community support. One evening, while I was tucking Emma into bed, she asked, "Dad, why was Mrs. Henderson so mean to everyone?" I thought about it for a moment. I think she forgot that being in charge means serving people, not controlling them. She got confused about what power is actually for. So she was a bad leader? She was a leader who forgot why leaders exist. The best leaders make things better for everyone. The worst leaders make things better for themselves. Emma nodded, processing this. "You're a good leader, Dad. You helped everyone." "I had a lot of help, sweetheart. Mrs. Patterson, the Ramirez-Dez family, and all our neighbors. We did it together. That's what good leaders do, right? They work with people instead of against them?" "Exactly." I kissed her forehead. "Now get some sleep. I hear you've got plans to ride your bike in your pajamas again tomorrow morning." She giggled. "And nobody can tell me not to." That's the spirit. The Margaret Henderson saga became something we rarely talked about after the first year. It wasn't because we'd forgotten or forgiven, but because we'd moved past it. The neighborhood had healed, stronger and more united than before. Gerald Henderson sold their house and moved to another state for a fresh start. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he was doing well, volunteering with domestic abuse organizations and helping others recognize patterns of controlling behavior. He'd turned his painful experience into something constructive. The house was sold to a young couple with twins who immediately became beloved members of the community. They hosted the annual Halloween party and never once complained about anyone else's decorations or lawn care. Now and then, I'd get contacted by someone from another HOA dealing with similar issues. Word had spread about our case, and people wanted advice on how to handle abusive boards or presidents. I always gave them the same guidance: document everything, build coalitions, know your rights, and never let bullies win through intimidation. Several communities successfully challenged their own problematic HOAs, using our case as a template. One sent me a thank you gift, a framed photo of their neighborhood with a plaque reading, "In appreciation for showing us that communities can fight back." It reminded me why I'd become a police officer in the first place. Not for power or authority, but to protect people who couldn't always protect themselves. Margaret Henderson had taught me that lesson applied everywhere, not just on the streets, but in neighborhoods, organizations, and communities of all kinds. Are you starting to feel like this story is wrapping up? Good. But there's one more piece I need to share with you, because this isn't just about Margaret getting what she deserved. It's about what we all learned from living through it. Here's what I learned from 18 months of dealing with Margaret Henderson and the aftermath of her reign of terror. Boundaries aren't just about saying no to bad behavior. They're about building the kind of community where bad behavior can't flourish in the first place. For years, everyone in Riverside Meadows knew Margaret was out of control. We saw her harassment, her power trips, her escalating cruelty. But we all stayed quiet, paid our fines, and hoped she'd leave us alone if we just complied. We enabled her through our silence, our fear, and our unwillingness to band together. That's the real lesson here. Margaret Henderson didn't become a tyrant overnight. She tested boundaries gradually, pushing a little further each time, seeing how much she could get away with. Every fine we paid without questioning, every violation we accepted without challenging, every neighbor we watched suffer without speaking up, all of it permitted her to go further. Evil doesn't usually announce itself with dramatic flair. It creeps in through small compromises and unchallenged abuses. It grows in the silence of good people who don't want to make waves. It thrives when we convince ourselves that standing up would be too difficult, too risky, or too inconvenient. But here's the flip side. Good also grows through small acts of courage. Every neighbor who documented their experiences, every person who showed up to that meeting, every witness who agreed to testify, they created a wave that swept Margaret's empire away. None of them were heroes on their own. Together they were unstoppable. I think about Mrs. Patterson a lot. This sweet 70-year-old widow who loved her garden, who'd been reduced to tears by Margaret's harassment, was terrified to speak up. But when I asked for help, she showed up. She gave a statement. She testified in court. She found courage she didn't know she had because she saw others finding theirs too. That's how change happens. Not through one person being extraordinary, but through ordinary people choosing collectively to say enough. If you're watching this and you're dealing with a Margaret Henderson of your own, whether it's an HOA president, a boss, a family member, or anyone else who's abusing their power over you, here's what I want you to understand. You're not powerless. You're never as powerless as they want you to believe. Yes, they might have authority. They might have official positions or rules that technically back them up. They can make your life difficult in the short term, but they can't withstand daylight. They can't survive documentation. They can't defeat a community that refuses to be divided. Start small. Document everything. Every incident, every violation, every unreasonable demand. Dates, times, witnesses, photos. Build your case like you're preparing for trial, because you might be. Evidence defeats gaslighting. Documentation defeats lies. Find your allies. You're probably not the only victim. Bullies and tyrants rarely focus their abuse on just one person. Reach out to others who've suffered. Share your stories privately. Build a coalition of witnesses who can support each other and verify each other's experiences. Know your rights. Whether it's HOA bylaws, employment law, tenant rights, or family law, educate yourself about the rules that actually apply to your situation. Abusers count on you not knowing what protections you have. Prove them wrong. Stay calm and strategic. Emotional reactions give bullies ammunition to paint you as the unreasonable one. Channel your anger into action. Be methodical. Be patient. Build an airtight case instead of lashing out in frustration. Use the system. Margaret thought she was above the law, above accountability, above consequences. She was wrong. Systems exist to protect people from exactly this kind of abuse. Use them. File complaints. Request audits. Demand transparency. Make the system work the way it was designed to work. And here's the most important part. Don't go it alone. I could have confronted Margaret by myself, used my position as police chief to intimidate her into backing down, but that wouldn't have solved the underlying problem. The community needed to stand together, to reclaim their power collectively, to build something better than what Margaret had destroyed. Real change isn't about one person defeating one tyrant. It's about communities learning they don't have to tolerate tyranny in the first place. Now, 3 years later, Riverside Meadows is everything a neighborhood should be. People look out for each other, kids play freely, families feel safe and welcome. The HOA serves the community instead of ruling it. We have oversight, transparency, and actual democratic participation. But it almost didn't happen. If we'd all stayed quiet one more month, one more year, who knows how much worse it could have gotten? How much more money might Margaret have stolen? How many more families might have been driven out of their homes by her harassment? The cost of standing up seemed high when we were afraid, but the cost of staying silent would have been so much higher. I'll leave you with a question, and I want you to think about this. What boundary do you need to protect? Where in your life are you tolerating behavior that shouldn't be tolerated? What Margaret Henderson is lurking in your world, slowly eroding your peace, your rights, or your community? And more importantly, who are your allies? Who else is suffering the same abuse? What coalition could you build if you just started talking to each other? Because here's what I know for certain after everything we went through. You're stronger than you think. Your community is more powerful than you realize, and the bullies counting on your silence will crumble the moment you find your voice. Margaret Henderson thought she was invincible. She ruled our neighborhood with an iron fist for years, collecting her fines and her bribes and her power trips. She thought nobody could touch her. She was wrong. And whoever is trying to control your life right now, they're wrong too. If this story resonated with you, if you've dealt with something similar, or if you're dealing with it right now, leave a comment below. Share your story. You never know who might read it and realize they're not alone. You never know whose courage you might inspire. And if you found this story helpful, inspiring, or just satisfying to watch a bully get what they deserve, hit that subscribe button, because there are more stories like this out there, more communities fighting back, more ordinary people doing extraordinary things when they decide enough is enough. Remember, boundaries aren't mean or rude or aggressive. Boundaries are necessary. They're how we protect ourselves, our families, and our communities from people who would exploit our kindness and silence. Margaret Henderson learned that lesson the hard way. Don't let someone else's Margaret Henderson teach you the same lesson at your expense. Stand up, document, find your allies, know your rights, use the system, and most importantly, never ever let a bully convince you that you're powerless, because you're not. Emma rides her bike in her pajamas now, and nobody says a word. That's not just freedom from one HOA president. That's freedom from the idea that anyone has the right to control how we live in our own homes. That's the real victory. What boundary will you protect today? Have you ever had a neighbor or HOA president who seemed to target you specifically? Please drop a comment and let me know, because Margaret's behavior was about to get so much worse. The harassment escalated. Margaret started walking by our house multiple times a day, always with her phone out, photographing everything. She'd zoom in on our front door, our windows, our roof. I'd see the flash of her camera from inside and feel this creeping violation, like my home was no longer my sanctuary. She sent violation notices for things that didn't exist. She claimed my garbage cans were odorous from across the street. She said my outdoor light fixture was non-compliant, even though it was identical to 15 other houses on our street. She threatened legal action when I didn't pay a fine for leaving my car parked in my own driveway in a way she deemed unsightly. I paid the fines, not because I agreed with them, but because I'd read the HOA covenants, and they gave the board the power to place liens on properties for unpaid violations. I wasn't going to risk my family's home over Margaret's power trip, but each payment felt like feeding a monster that just grew hungrier. Other neighbors started quietly approaching me during those months. Tom and Linda Ramirez, 2 doors down, whispered that Margaret had fined them $300 for their kids' swing set being visible from the street. The Johnsons got violation notices for their garden gnomes. Mrs. Patterson, the sweet 70-year-old widow, was hit with fines for her flower boxes extending 3 inches past the approved distance from her house. Everyone was terrified. Margaret had made it clear she could make your life miserable if you challenged her. She'd show up to HOA meetings with printed Google Earth images, zooming in on people's properties to point out violations no human eye could spot from street level. She'd cross-reference paint colors against the approved palette, using some digital color matching system. The woman had turned HOA enforcement into a full-time obsession, and we were all her victims. But here's what Margaret didn't know. I was documenting everything. Every violation notice, every payment, every photo she took. I'd started keeping a log with timestamps and witness names. It was a habit from 22 years in law enforcement. When something feels wrong, you build a case. I didn't know yet how bad things would get before I could use it. Emma got sick in early November. What started as a simple cold turned into a nasty flu that knocked her flat. Sarah and I took turns staying home from work, monitoring her fever and making sure she stayed hydrated. For 3 days, Emma barely left her bed except to use the bathroom. On the 4th day, she was feeling slightly better, well enough to come downstairs in her pajamas and curl up on the couch with her stuffed unicorn, watching cartoons while I worked from home on some administrative reports. Sarah had gone to the pharmacy to pick up Emma's prescription refill. The community was quiet that afternoon. Most people were at work or school. I was deep into budget spreadsheets when I heard Emma's weak voice call out, "Daddy, someone's at the door." I looked up, expecting to see a delivery driver. Instead, through the front window, I saw Margaret Henderson marching up our walkway with that familiar purposeful stride, her phone already out and recording. I opened the door before she could knock. "Margaret, now's not a good time. My daughter is sick." "I can see that," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Which is why I'm here. I've received multiple complaints about your daughter being visible in the front windows in her pajamas during daytime hours. It's a violation of our community appearance standards." I stared at her, trying to process what I'd just heard. "You're complaining about a sick 9-year-old in pajamas inside her own house?" "The windows face the street, Chief Chen. Anything visible from the street falls under the HOA's purview. I've documented 3 separate days this week where your daughter has been clearly visible in inappropriate daytime attire. Each instance is a separate violation." My hands clenched at my sides. 22 years of professional composure kept my voice level. "Margaret, she has the flu. She's recovering on the couch. She's not doing anything wrong." "The rules don't have exceptions for illness," Margaret said, typing something on her phone. "I'm issuing 3 violation notices, $150 each. And in the future, I'll need you to ensure your windows are covered if your daughter insists on wearing sleepwear during daytime hours." That's when Emma appeared behind me, holding her unicorn, her face pale and confused. "Daddy, what's wrong?" Margaret's eyes lit up like she'd won the lottery. She lifted her phone, clearly recording, and said loudly, "You see? This is exactly what I'm talking about. This is unacceptable for a family community." I stepped forward, blocking her view of Emma, my cop voice coming out in full force. "You need to leave. Now." For the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in Margaret's eyes, but it vanished quickly, replaced by that familiar arrogance. "You can't intimidate me, Chief Chen. I know my rights. This is HOA business, and you're subject to the same rules as everyone else." She turned and walked away, calling back over her shoulder. "You'll receive the formal notices by the end of the day, and if you continue to resist compliance, I'll be forced to pursue legal action." I closed the door and knelt down next to Emma, who was crying. "Am I in trouble, Daddy? Did I do something bad?" "No, sweetheart. You didn't do anything wrong. That lady is just confused about the rules." But inside, something had shifted. For 8 months, I'd tolerated Margaret's harassment. I'd paid her ridiculous fines. I'd maintained professional composure even as she systematically tormented my family and neighbors. But going after my sick daughter? That crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed.
That night, after Emma was asleep, Sarah and I sat at the kitchen table with my thick folder of documentation. I'd been collecting evidence out of general principle, but now I spread it all out with purpose. "She's not going to stop," Sarah said quietly. "Even if we pay these fines, she'll just find something else. She'll keep coming after Emma. I know." I stared at the pile of orange violation notices, the photos, the payment receipts, and I'm done letting her. Here's the thing about being a police chief. You know the law, not just criminal law, but civil law, property law, ordinances, and regulations. And you know how investigations work, how to build cases that hold up under scrutiny, how to catch people who think they're untouchable. I'd been treating Margaret like a nuisance. It was time to treat her like a case. Started that night. While Sarah monitored Emma upstairs, I pulled up my laptop and began documenting everything in a proper case file format. I created a timeline spreadsheet with every violation Margaret had issued to us, cross-referenced with photos proving compliance. I added similar violations issued to neighbors, creating a pattern analysis. Then I did something Margaret probably never expected. I filed a formal public records request with the county for all HOA registration documents, meeting minutes, and financial statements. In our state, HOAs are required to maintain certain records and follow specific procedures. Margaret had been so focused on enforcing her made-up rules that I doubted she'd been diligent about following the actual legal requirements. The records arrived within 10 business days, and they were a goldmine. I spent 3 evenings going through them with the kind of attention to detail I usually reserved for major criminal cases. Margaret had been sloppy. HOA meeting minutes were incomplete or missing entirely. Financial statements showed irregular expenses with vague descriptions like community enhancement and consulting fees that totaled thousands of dollars. The violation tracking system was inconsistent, showing that some homeowners received fines for issues other homeowners got away with completely. But the real jackpot was buried in the architectural guidelines. Margaret had made numerous modifications to her own home without proper approvals, including those oversized columns, a kitchen extension that violated setback requirements, and a backyard deck that exceeded the allowed square footage. She'd approved her own modifications by simply not recording them in the official minutes. I called my old friend Jake Morrison, who'd retired from the force and become a licensed private investigator. We'd worked dozens of cases together, and I trusted him completely. "Jake, I need surveillance photos of a property," I told him, explaining the situation. He laughed. "You want me to stake out an HOA president? Marcus, that's beneath your pay grade. It's personal now." "She went after my daughter." His tone changed immediately. "Send me the address." Over the next 2 weeks, Jake documented Margaret's daily routine. Photos of her modifications, timestamps of her driving through the neighborhood with her phone out photographing properties, and evidence of her taking violation photos while parked in her car. But I needed more. I needed Margaret to expose herself completely, to show her true colors in a way that couldn't be disputed or explained away. And I needed witnesses. How was I going to trap her? Good, because the setup was meticulous, and Margaret was about to walk right into it without ever seeing it coming. I called an emergency neighborhood meeting, not through the HOA, but as an informal gathering. I reached out to every homeowner I knew who'd been harassed, which was basically everyone. 23 families showed up at the Ramirez house on a Tuesday evening. I know everyone here has been dealing with Margaret's behavior. I started standing in their living room while people sat on couches and folding chairs, and I know most of you are afraid to speak up because you don't want to be targeted more. But I've been documenting everything, and I think we have grounds to challenge her. Tom Ramirez spoke up. Challenge her how she controls the board. She can vote to do whatever she wants. Actually, she can't. I pulled out my folder. According to the HOA bylaws, the board is required to have at least 3 members. Margaret dissolved the other positions 6 months ago and has been acting as a single-person board, which is explicitly prohibited. Every violation she's issued since then is legally questionable. Murmurs of interest rippled through the room. But here's what I need from all of you, I continued. I need written statements about every violation you've received, every interaction you've had with Margaret, and every fine you've paid. I need photos showing that you complied when she cited you. I need dates, times, and details. We're going to build a case so airtight that Margaret won't be able to wriggle out of it. Mrs. Patterson raised her hand, her voice shaking slightly. What if she retaliates? What if this makes it worse? I looked at her and saw the same fear I'd seen in countless domestic violence victims. People who'd been terrorized by someone who held power over them. It made me angry in a way that few things could. She's already making it as bad as she can, I said quietly. The only way it gets better is if we stand together and hold her accountable. And I promise you, I know exactly how to do this. Over the next week, statements poured in. I received 47 written complaints, hundreds of photos, and documentation of over $12,000 in questionable fines Margaret had collected in the past year alone. I also did something else, something I'd learned from years of investigation work. I set bait. I placed a new mailbox at the end of my driveway. It was the exact model specified in the HOA guidelines, the exact approved color, installed at the exact approved height. I had photos, receipts, and measurements documenting everything. It was so perfectly compliant that there was literally nothing wrong with it. Then I waited to see if Margaret would take the bait.
She couldn't help herself. 3 days after I installed the mailbox, an orange envelope appeared on my door. Violation notice, non-compliant mailbox installation. I smiled when I read it. She'd just put everything in writing. claiming a violation that provably didn't exist, documented with timestamps and photos that would show she'd fabricated it completely. But that wasn't the trap springing. That was just the trigger. The real trap came the following week, on that afternoon when I saw Margaret Henderson wrapping a chain around my daughter. Let me back up and tell you what actually happened, because the image I described at the start was exactly what I saw through my window, and it was exactly what Margaret intended for me to see. But the full story shows just how calculated this woman was. Emma was feeling much better but still recovering at home. She'd gotten the okay from her doctor to do light outdoor activities, so she was sitting on our front porch reading a book, still in her comfortable unicorn pajamas, because why should a sick kid have to get fully dressed to sit on her own porch? I was working in my home office with the window open when I heard Emma's startled voice. "What are you doing? Stop!" I rushed to the living room window and saw Margaret on our porch. But this is what I saw. She'd draped a decorative chain we used for a porch plant across Emma's lap and was positioning it for a photo to make it look like Emma was chained there. Emma, confused and scared, was trying to move the chain off while Margaret kept repositioning it, holding her phone up to get the shot she wanted. I was through the front door in seconds. "Get away from my daughter, now!" Margaret turned, and on her face was an expression of theatrical shock, like she'd been rehearsing in a mirror. "Chief Chen? I was documenting another violation. Your daughter is outside in her pajamas, clearly visible from the street, and she's tangled in this unsafe chain." "That's not our chain." I looked at it more closely. It was similar to ours, but newer, shinier. "You brought that from your property." "Don't be ridiculous. I found this dangerous item on your porch and was documenting the safety hazard." "Stop lying." My voice was level but cold. "Emma, go inside to your mother." Emma scrambled up, knocking the chain to the porch floor, and ran past me into the house. I could hear her crying, hear Sarah's voice comforting her. Margaret straightened, clutching her phone. "You're being hostile and aggressive, Chief Chen. I'm documenting this interaction. You're trying to intimidate an HOA officer performing her duties. You just staged a photograph to make it look like you found my daughter chained to our porch." "I did no such thing. This is defamation. I have security cameras." The words hung in the air between us. Margaret's face went very still. "I have 3 security cameras with full coverage of my front porch and driveway," I continued, speaking clearly and calmly. "They've been recording continuously for the past 6 months. Every interaction you've had with my property, every photograph you've taken, every violation notice you've placed on my door, all recorded with timestamps and audio." I could see her mind working, trying to figure out if I was bluffing. I wasn't. The footage shows you arriving with that chain. It shows you positioning it on my daughter while she tried to push it away. It shows you holding your phone at multiple angles to stage photographs. All of it is documented. Margaret's expression shifted rapidly. Shock, anger, fear, then back to her familiar arrogance. "So what? I was documenting violations. That's my job as HOA president. You can record me all you want. I'm doing nothing wrong." "You're trespassing. You're harassing a minor. And you're about to be the subject of a very thorough investigation." She laughed, but it sounded forced. "By who? You? Everyone knows you hate following rules. You're abusing your position to harass me because you don't like being held accountable." "By the entire HOA membership, actually." I pulled my phone from my pocket and sent a pre-written text message. Within 30 seconds, neighbors started appearing on their lawns, walking out of their houses, emerging from garages. Tom and Linda Ramirez, the Johnsons, Mrs. Patterson, 15 families, all visible, all watching. "What is this?" Margaret's voice climbed higher. "These are your other victims," I said. "Every person you've fined, harassed, and terrorized for the past year. They're all here as witnesses to your behavior. They've all filed formal complaints. And right now, they're documenting your presence on my property, your harassment of my daughter, and your attempt to fabricate evidence." Tom Ramirez held up his phone, clearly recording. So did Linda. So did Mrs. Patterson. Cameras surrounded Margaret, all pointed at her, and the realization was dawning on her face that she'd walked into something she couldn't control. You can't do this! I'm the president of the HOA! I have authority! You had authority, I corrected, over an illegally structured board that you dissolved contrary to the bylaws. Every violation notice you've issued in the past 6 months is legally questionable. And based on the financial records I've obtained, you've also been misappropriating HOA funds. Her face went pale. That's slander. I'll sue you. It's a documented fact. $47,000 in questionable expenses, Margaret. Consulting fees paid to companies that don't exist. Receipts for community improvements that were never made. I've traced the money. I know where it went. That was a slight exaggeration. I'd traced some of it, enough to establish a pattern, but the full investigation would require forensic accounting. But Margaret didn't know that, and the look on her face told me I'd hit the target. You have no right. I have every right. I'm a homeowner who's been systematically harassed. And as a law enforcement officer, I have a duty to report suspected financial crimes. I held up my phone. I'm calling a friend at the district attorney's office right now to discuss potential fraud charges. But first, I'm calling social services about your harassment of a minor. Margaret's mouth opened and closed. For the first time since I'd known her, she had no words, no comeback, no condescending remark. She looked around at the circle of neighbors, all watching, all recording, and I saw the exact moment she realized she was finished. She backed toward her Mercedes, stumbling slightly off our porch steps. This isn't over. You'll all regret this. I'll file complaints with the county, with the state HOA board, with the police. I am the police, I reminded her. In this county anyway. And your complaints are welcome. I'm sure my officers would love to hear about how you staged photographs of child endangerment. She got into her car, fumbled with her keys, and screeched away from my house at a speed that definitely violated our community's 15-mile-per-hour limit. Mrs. Patterson walked over to me, tears in her eyes. Is it really over? Did we actually stop her? Not yet, I said, watching Margaret's Mercedes disappear around the corner. But we're about to. I made good on my promises. That evening, I filed a formal complaint with the county's HOA regulatory board, submitting a 300-page document that included every violation notice Margaret had issued, an analysis showing the pattern of selective enforcement, financial irregularities, and bylaws violations. I also filed a report with Child Protective Services regarding Margaret's harassment of Emma, attaching the security footage showing her staging the chain photograph. While CPS determined there weren't grounds for criminal charges, they documented the incident and flagged Margaret's behavior as concerning. But the real action happened within the HOA itself. I called for an emergency special meeting of the Homeowners Association following the procedures outlined in the bylaws that Margaret had been ignoring. By law, any 10 homeowners could petition for a special meeting, and I had 47 signatures within 24 hours. The meeting was scheduled for 2 weeks later at the community clubhouse. Margaret tried to cancel it, sending out an email claiming it was improperly filed and not recognized by the board. But the bylaws were clear, and when I replied with a point-by-point legal analysis copied to every homeowner's email address, she went quiet. During those 2 weeks, I continued building the case. I hired a forensic accountant out of my own pocket to examine the HOA financial records. His report confirmed what I'd suspected. Margaret had been systematically siphoning money through fake vendor invoices, inflated service contracts with companies she partly owned, and direct transfers disguised as emergency maintenance funds. Total misappropriation, over $63,000 in 3 years. I also discovered that Margaret had been conducting what essentially amounted to extortion. Several homeowners had paid her directly, outside the official HOA accounting system, to make violations go away. She'd created a protection racket inside our own neighborhood, where people paid bribes to avoid her harassment. Jake Morrison's surveillance photos showed Margaret meeting with 3 different homeowners in parking lots, exchanging cash for documents. We had timestamps, locations, and in one case an audio recording from a participant who'd agreed to wear a wire after I explained what we were documenting. The night of the special meeting, 93 of the development's 112 households attended. The clubhouse was packed, standing room only, with an energy that felt like a powder keg waiting for a spark. Margaret arrived 15 minutes late, strutting in with her usual confidence, Gerald trailing behind her, looking miserable. She'd dressed for battle, a severe black suit, her hair in a tight bun, her expression locked in that familiar mask of superiority. She went straight to the front table where the board usually sat and arranged her materials, ignoring the crowd completely. I stood up from my seat in the second row. "Margaret, you're not conducting this meeting. It's a special meeting called by the homeowners under Section 7.3 of the bylaws. You're welcome to sit with the rest of us." Her head snapped up, eyes flashing anger. "This is my meeting. I'm the president of this HOA. Actually, you're not." I walked to the front of the room, feeling 93 pairs of eyes on me. According to the bylaws, the HOA board requires a minimum of 3 elected members: president, vice president, and secretary. You dissolved those positions 6 months ago, which means you've been acting without legal authority. The board voted to consolidate. You can't vote alone. That's the whole point. I opened my folder and pulled out printed copies of the bylaws, passing them around. Section 4.2, paragraph 3. The board shall consist of no fewer than 3 members, elected by majority vote of the homeowners. You've been operating an illegal board for 6 months, Margaret. Every decision you've made in that time is null and void. The room erupted in whispers and murmurs. Margaret's face flushed red. Tom Ramirez stood up. "Does that mean the fines are invalid?" "It means everything is questionable," I said, "which is why we're here tonight, to properly elect a new board, review the financial records, and address the violations that have been issued." "This is a coup," Margaret said, her voice shaking with rage. "You're trying to overthrow the legitimate leadership of this HOA." "There is no legitimate leadership right now," I interrupted. "That's what we're fixing." Mrs. Patterson raised her hand timidly. "I'd like to nominate Marcus Chen for president of the HOA." "Seconded," 3 voices called simultaneously. Margaret slammed her hand on the table. "No, you can't just... This isn't how it works. There are procedures, nomination periods, proper voting protocols." "You're absolutely right," I said calmly, "which is why I've prepared a detailed agenda following Robert's Rules of Order and the HOA bylaws exactly." I held up another document. "We'll conduct this meeting properly, unlike the chaos you've been running," and we did. For the next 3 hours, we methodically went through every required procedure. We established that a quorum was present. We elected a temporary chairman to run the meeting impartially. We nominated candidates for board positions. We voted. When the dust settled, I'd been elected president by an 87-6 vote. Tom Ramirez was vice president. Linda Martinez, an attorney who lived on Oak Street, was the secretary. We had a legal, properly constituted board. Then came the reckoning. I presented the financial analysis to the membership, projecting the forensic accountant's report on a screen at the front of the room. Columns of numbers showing unexplained expenses, fake vendors, and inflated contracts. A clear, documented pattern of fraud. The room went silent as people processed what they were seeing. $63,000, I said quietly. Stolen from our community by someone we trusted to protect it. Margaret stood up, her chair scraping loudly. "This is defamation! Lies and manipulation from someone who wants revenge because he couldn't follow simple rules." "Sit down, Margaret." The voice came from Gerald Henderson, Margaret's husband, who'd been sitting silently in the back row. He walked forward, and I could see he'd been crying. "Just sit down," he repeated. "It's over." "Gerald, don't you dare." "I'm so tired," he said, his voice breaking. I've watched you destroy our retirement savings with your schemes. I've watched you terrorize our neighbors for fun. I've watched you become someone I don't even recognize, and I can't do it anymore." He turned to the crowd. "Everything Marcus said is true. I have copies of bank statements, receipts, everything. Margaret's been funneling HOA money into personal accounts for years. She spent it on designer clothes, spa treatments, and trips she told me were HOA conferences. I found out 6 months ago, and I've been documenting it, trying to figure out what to do." He pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket and handed it to me. "This is everything you need to file charges. I already spoke to a lawyer. I'm filing for divorce, and I'm cooperating fully with any investigation." Margaret stared at her husband like he'd stabbed her. How could you betray me like this?" "Betray you?" Gerald's laugh was bitter. "You've been betraying this entire community. You've been betraying me. I'm done protecting you from the consequences of your own actions." He walked out, and Margaret stood there in front of 93 witnesses, exposed and defeated. "I move that we authorize the board to pursue criminal charges against Margaret Henderson for fraud and embezzlement," Linda Martinez said formally. "Seconded," Tom Ramirez called. The vote was unanimous, 93-0. Margaret left the meeting in shambles, her carefully constructed image shattered beyond repair. Security footage from the clubhouse cameras later showed her sitting in her Mercedes in the parking lot for 40 minutes, just staring straight ahead before finally driving away. The criminal investigation moved quickly once Gerald provided the documentation. The district attorney assigned a white-collar crimes prosecutor who'd been looking for a high-profile fraud case. Margaret Henderson, the tyrannical HOA president who'd terrorized a suburban development, became exactly that. Local news picked up the story within a week. "HOA president charged with embezzlement. Neighbors say she ruled through fear and fines." The coverage was brutal. Reporters interviewed Mrs. Patterson, who tearfully described being afraid to plant flowers in her own yard. They interviewed the Ramirez family, who showed documentation of over $2,000 in bogus fines they'd paid over 18 months. And they interviewed me, though I kept it brief and professional. I wasn't interested in personal revenge or public humiliation. I just wanted justice and peace for our community. But the court of public opinion was less forgiving. Margaret's face appeared on the evening news, that same haughty expression she'd worn while terrorizing us, now frozen in mugshot form. Social media exploded. The story got picked up nationally. HOA Karen goes too far, embezzles $63,000, harasses police chief's sick daughter.